The crack of the gavel against wood echoed through the dusty auction hall, silencing the murmur of voices. Lillian Matthews clutched her 3-month-old daughter Emma to her chest, trying to shield the infant from the cruel stares of the men who had come to bid on them. Tears stung her eyes as she stood on the makeshift platform, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin. This wasn't supposed to be her life, not in Montana Territory, 1875. Next up, a healthy woman, 22 years of age along with her infant child, the auctioneer announced, his voice devoid of emotion. The woman can cook, clean, and has experience as a seamstress. Bidding starts at $50. Lillian trembled as she watched the sea of unfamiliar faces. Some men leered at her. Others appraised her with cold calculation, as if she were livestock rather than a human being. Her husband Thomas had been dead less than a month, ambushed by outlaws while traveling to their homestead with supplies. His debts had mounted quickly, and without family to turn to, she'd been seized as property to be sold to cover what was owed. $50, called a portly man with yellow teeth and alcohol on his breath. 60, countered another, a rail-thin man with cruel eyes. The bidding continued, each increment causing Lillian's heart to sink further. These men didn't want a seamstress or a cook. The looks they gave her made their intentions clear enough, and none seemed to care about the baby in her arms, a complication they'd tolerate to get what they wanted. 120, shouted a red-faced rancher whose reputation for cruelty preceded him. The auctioneer looked pleased. 120 going once. $500. The crowd fell silent, heads turning toward the back of the room. A tall figure stepped forward, the midday sun from the windows silhouetting him momentarily before he moved into the light. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, he wore a dust-covered duster over dark clothes. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but Lillian could see a strong jaw darkened with several days' worth of beard. The auctioneer stuttered, $500 from Mr. Wade Thornton. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The red-faced rancher glared at the newcomer but didn't raise the bid. Even he couldn't or wouldn't match such an exorbitant sum. 500 going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Thornton. Lillian's legs nearly gave out beneath her. $500 was an outrageous amount, more than most men would pay for prime farmland, let alone a widow and her child. Relief mingled with terror as she wondered what kind of man would pay such a price, and what he would expect in return. The cowboy Wade Thornton approached the platform with measured steps. Up close, she could see his eyes were a striking blue against his sun-darkened skin. He couldn't be much older than 30, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the hardness etched into it, and a thin scar that ran along his left jawline. "The papers," he said to the auctioneer, his voice deep and quiet. While the transaction was completed, Lillian stood frozen, clutching Emma tighter as the baby began to fuss. When Wade finally turned to her, she met his gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. "Mrs. Matthews," he said with a slight nod, then surprised her by pulling a knife from his belt. Lillian flinched, but he merely reached for her bound wrists and cut the rope away. The sudden release made her wince as blood rushed back to her fingers. "My wagon's outside," he said simply, then turned and walked toward the exit, clearly expecting her to follow. With no choice, Lillian adjusted Emma in her arms and followed him through the crowd, feeling the burning stares of the men who had been outbid. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding after the dimness of the auction hall. Wade led her to a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. It was well maintained but not ostentatious, loaded with supplies covered by canvas. "Where are you taking us?" Lillian finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. Wade secured the bill of sale in his coat pocket before answering. "My ranch. It's about a day's ride from here." He gestured to the wagon. "There's water and food if you're hungry. We should get moving if we want to make good distance before nightfall." He offered his hand to help her up to the wagon seat, but Lillian hesitated. "Why did you buy us, Mr. Thornton?" Something flickered across his face so quickly she almost missed it. "That's a conversation for the trail, madam." His tone wasn't unkind, but it made clear the discussion was over for now. With Emma whimpering against her shoulder, Lillian had little choice but to accept his hand and climb onto the wagon seat. Wade settled beside her, took up the reins, and with a gentle flick, set the horses in motion. They traveled in silence through the small town of Silver Creek. Lillian felt the curious stares of townsfolk, some pitying, others judgmental. Once they had left the town behind, the vast Montana landscape opened before them, rolling hills covered in spring grass, distant mountains still capped with snow, and a sky so wide and blue it seemed impossible. After nearly an hour of silence broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional sound from Emma, Wade finally spoke. "I knew your husband," he said, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Lillian turned to him in surprise. "You knew Thomas?" Wade nodded. "Not well. Met him at the general store in Silver Creek a few times. Seemed like a decent man." He paused. "Heard about what happened to him. It wasn't right." "No," Lillian agreed softly, memories of Thomas flooding back his gentle smile, his dreams of building a life in this wild country. "It wasn't. When I heard his widow and child were being sold to cover his debts." Wade's jaw tightened. "That wasn't right either." Lillian studied him, trying to understand. "So you spent $500 on principal, Mr. Thornton." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Something like that." "And what do you expect in return?" she asked directly, needing to know where she stood. Wade glanced at her, then back at the trail. "I need help running my ranch house. Cook, clean, mend the things you know how to do. I've got a small operation, just me and 2 hands. We manage the cattle, but the house," he shrugged, "it could use a woman's touch." "And that's all," Lillian pressed, unable to believe it could be so simple. Wade's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Matthews, I may have bought your debt, but I didn't buy you. You'll have your own room. The baby, too. You work for me until the debt's paid, then you're free to go wherever you please." Relief washed through her, though caution kept her from fully believing him. Men's promises came cheap, as she'd learned the hard way. Still, something in his straightforward manner gave her hope that perhaps he was telling the truth. "Thank you," she said quietly. Wade nodded once, then reached beneath the seat and pulled out a canteen. "Water," he said, offering it to her. "There's bread and cheese in the sack behind you if you're hungry." As Lillian took the canteen, Emma began to cry in earnest. The infant had been remarkably patient through the ordeal, but her tiny face now screwed up in hunger and discomfort. "She needs to be fed and changed," Lillian explained, feeling awkward. Without comment, Wade guided the wagon off the trail toward a stand of cottonwood trees. "We can stop here for a spell," he said, bringing the horses to a halt in the shade. He climbed down and busied himself checking the horses, deliberately keeping his back, turned to give her privacy. Lillian felt a surge of gratitude for this small kindness as she tended to Emma. The baby quieted once her needs were met, blinking up at her mother with innocent trust that brought tears to Lillian's eyes. What kind of future could she provide for her daughter now? Would they truly find safety with this stranger, or was she merely trading one form of bondage for another? When Emma was settled, Lillian called softly to Wade. He returned, offering a hand to help her back onto the wagon seat. "She's a quiet little thing," he observed, glancing at the now content baby. "Emma," Lillian said, Her name is Emma. Wade nodded. Emma, he repeated, and something in the gentle way he said her daughter's name made Lillian's chest tighten. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they headed north. Wade pointed out landmarks, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, a creek where the fishing was good, distant buttes that glowed red in the late afternoon sun. Lillian found herself relaxing slightly as the miles passed, lulled by his deep voice and the rhythmic motion of the wagon. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Wade guided the wagon off the main trail toward a small clearing near a stream. "We'll camp here for the night," he said. "It's still a half-day's ride to the ranch." Lillian hadn't camped outdoors since the journey west with Thomas, and the prospect of spending the night in the open with a stranger and her infant daughter sent anxiety crawling through her veins. But Wade went about making camp with quiet efficiency, unloading supplies and starting a small fire while giving her space. "There's a bedroll for you and the little one," he said, pointing to a bundle he'd laid near the fire. "I'll sleep on the other side of the wagon." As darkness fell, they shared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and coffee. Emma slept in a nest of blankets beside Lillian, tiny fists occasionally twitching in her sleep. "You said you have a small ranch," Lillian ventured, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Have you been in Montana territory long?" Wade took a sip of coffee before answering. 5 years. Came up from Texas after the war. Wanted land of my own." His eyes reflected the firelight as he gazed into the flames. "Started with 20 head of cattle and a run-down cabin. Got about 200 head now, and I built a proper house last year." "You built it yourself," he nodded. "With help from my hands, Jackson and Caleb. Good men." He glanced at her. "They live in the bunkhouse a ways from the main house. You won't be bothered." Lillian appreciated his attempt to reassure her, but doubt still lingered. "Mr. Thornton, Wade," he interrupted. "Just call me Wade." "Wade," she amended. "I'm grateful for what you did today, truly. But I need to understand why $500 is." She shook her head. "It's an enormous sum to pay for a housekeeper." Wade set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. The firelight carved deep shadows beneath his cheekbones and brow, making him appear older, more weathered. "I had a sister," he said after a long moment. "Mary. After our parents died, it was just the two of us. She married young to a man who turned out to be no good. When he died owing money, she ended up. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. She didn't survive a year." Lillian's heart ached for the pain evident in his voice. "I'm sorry. I couldn't help her then," Wade continued. "I was fighting in the war. By the time I got back, it was too late." His eyes moved to Emma's sleeping form. "When I heard about you and your daughter, I thought maybe this time I could make a difference." The simple honesty in his words touched something deep within Lillian. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps she and Emma might find a safe harbor after all. "Thank you," she said again, but this time the words carried the full weight of her gratitude. Wade nodded once, then rose to his feet. "Should get some rest. We'll head out at first light." As promised, he retired to the far side of the wagon, leaving Lillian alone with her thoughts. She settled beside Emma on the bedroll, listening to the night sounds of the Montana wilderness, the gentle rush of the stream, the distant call of a coyote, the soft nickering of the horses. Despite her uncertainty about what lay ahead, exhaustion pulled her toward sleep. Her last thought before drifting off was that perhaps fate had been kinder than she'd initially believed when it placed her on that auction block. The journey to Wade's ranch resumed at dawn. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wild sage as they traveled through increasingly rugged country. Emma was in better spirits after a night's rest, and Lillian found herself more willing to engage in conversation with the quiet cowboy beside her. "What kind of cattle do you raise?" she asked as they forded a shallow stream. "Herefords mostly," Wade replied. "They handle the Montana winters better than most breeds." "Thomas dreamed of having cattle someday," Lillian said, surprised by how easily her husband's name now came to her lips. "We had just enough saved to buy the land, but not the stock. He was planning to work for one of the big outfits until we could afford our own herd." Wade nodded. "It's not an easy life, but it's a good one when things go right." He glanced at her. "You ever live on a ranch before?" "No," Lillian admitted. "I grew up in St. Louis. My father was a clerk in a mercantile. I knew nothing about ranch life until I met Thomas." She smiled faintly at the memory. "He painted such a vivid picture of the life we'd build that I could see it clear as day, our own land, a sturdy house, children playing in the yard." "Why'd you agree to come west with him?" Wade asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Lillian considered the question. "I loved him," she said simply. "And I believed in his dream, still do even though." She trailed off, swallowing past the sudden tightness in her throat. Wade didn't press her to continue, and she was grateful for his understanding. They rode in companionable silence for a while until Emma began to fuss. Wade stopped the wagon without being asked, allowing Lillian to tend to her daughter's needs. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape opened into a broad valley cradled by distant mountains. Wade pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings was just visible in the distance. "Thornton Ranch," he said, a note of pride in his voice. As they drew closer, Lillian could make out the details: a substantial log house with a covered porch, a large barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and various outbuildings. It wasn't grand by Eastern standards, but by Montana Territory measures, it represented significant prosperity. Two men emerged from the barn as the wagon approached. One was tall and lanky with reddish hair, the other shorter and stockier with a full beard. Both looked curiously at Lillian and the baby as Wade brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house. "Mrs. Matthews, this is Jackson Cooper and Caleb Winters," Wade said, nodding toward the men. "My ranch hands. Boys, this is Mrs. Lillian Matthews and her daughter Emma. They'll be staying with us." The men touched their hats respectfully. "Madam," they greeted in unison, though their eyes held questions they were too polite to ask. "Mrs. Matthews will be helping with the house," Wade explained, which seemed to satisfy their curiosity for the moment. "Good to meet you, madam," said Jackson, the taller of the two. "Boss has been needing someone to civilize the place a bit." "That's for certain," agreed Caleb with a good-natured grin. "We ain't much for housekeeping." Wade helped Lillian down from the wagon. "Jackson, see to the horses. Caleb, bring Mrs. Matthews's things to the house." He turned to Lillian. "I'll show you around." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly spacious, with a large main room containing a stone fireplace, a solid table with chairs, and several comfortable-looking pieces of furniture. A kitchen area occupied one end of the room with a cast-iron stove, a pump for water, and shelves stocked with provisions. Though clean enough, the space clearly lacked a woman's touch: no curtains at the windows, no decorative touches, just the bare necessities. "There are 2 bedrooms," Wade said, leading her down a short hallway. "Mine's at the end. This one will be yours and Emma's." He opened a door to reveal a simply furnished room with a bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin and pitcher. A window looked out toward the mountains. "It's lovely," Lillian said, and meant it. After the uncertainty of the past weeks, the simple room felt like luxury. "Bathrooms out back," Wade continued. "We've got a pump in the kitchen for washing up. In summer, there's a creek not far if you want a proper bath. Water's clean." Caleb appeared with her meager possessions, a single trunk containing the few items she'd been allowed to keep after Thomas's debts were tallied. Wade nodded his thanks to the ranch hand, who retreated with another respectful "Madam" to Lillian. Left alone with Wade, Lillian felt a sudden awkwardness descend. This man had spent a small fortune to rescue her and Emma from a terrible fate, yet he remained largely a mystery to her. "I should let you get settled," Wade said, seeming to sense her discomfort. "You must be tired from the journey. Rest today. Tomorrow we can talk about your duties." "Thank you," Lillian said, then added impulsively, "for everything." Something flickered in Wade's blue eyes, not quite a smile, but a softening. He nodded once, then left her alone in the room that was now hers. Lillian sat on the edge of the bed, Emma cradled against her chest. The baby had fallen asleep, her tiny face peaceful. For the first time since Thomas's death, Lillian allowed herself to breathe freely. They were safe, at least for now. Whatever the future held, today they had shelter, protection, and the kindness of a stranger who had asked for nothing in return. She carefully laid Emma on the bed, surrounding her with pillows to prevent her from rolling, then moved to the window. The view was spectacular, rolling grassland stretching to distant mountains, a small herd of cattle grazing peacefully in a nearby meadow, hawks circling lazily in the vast blue sky. It was the kind of view Thomas had described to her back in St. Louis, the kind of land he had dreamed of calling their own. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Wade stood there, holding a tray with a plate of food and a cup of steaming tea. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on the small table. "It's just bread and cold meat, but it'll tide you over until supper." The unexpected thoughtfulness touched her. "Thank you." Wade lingered in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling it. "I'll be out with the herd for the rest of the day. Jackson and Caleb too. You have the house to yourself. Make yourself at home." After he'd gone, Lillian ate the simple meal with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. The bread was a bit stale and the meat tough, but it was freely given, and that made all the difference. With Emma still sleeping peacefully, Lillian decided to explore the house. The kitchen was well stocked but poorly organized, with pots and pans stacked haphazardly, and provisions jumbled together on shelves. The living area was similarly functional, but lacking in comfort. No cushions on the chairs, no rugs on the wooden floors, nothing to soften the masculine practicality of the space. Wade's bedroom, which she glimpsed through a partially open door, was as austere as she might have expected: a large bed with plain bedding, a chest for clothing, a gun rack on the wall, a small table with a lamp and a few books. Nothing personal, nothing that spoke of the man beyond his basic needs. By the time Emma woke hungry and demanding attention, Lillian had formed a clear picture of the household she would be managing. 3 men who knew cattle and horses but little about creating a home. A house that was solid and well built but lacking in the comforts that transformed shelter into sanctuary. And herself a widow with an infant, dependent on the continued goodwill of a man she barely knew. "We'll make the best of it, Emma," she whispered to her daughter as she nursed her. "We'll make this a proper home, and perhaps in time we'll find our own way." The 3 men returned as dusk was falling. Lillian, having familiarized herself with the kitchen, had prepared a simple supper of beans, salt pork, and biscuits. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling, and the appreciative looks on their faces as they entered the house and smelled the food told her it was welcome. "Something smells mighty good," Caleb said, removing his hat as he entered. "Mrs. Matthews," Wade greeted her with surprise. "You didn't need to cook today." "I wanted to," Lillian replied. "It's the least I can do to thank you for your hospitality." The men washed up outside, then gathered around the table. Emma lay in a makeshift cradle Lillian had fashioned from a wooden box lined with blankets. The baby watched the proceedings with wide, curious eyes, occasionally making soft, cooing sounds. Conversation was minimal during the meal. The men focused on eating after a long day's work. But as they finished, Caleb and Jackson began to tell stories of ranch life, amusing tales of stubborn cattle, unexpected weather, and the everyday challenges of carving a living from the Montana wilderness. Wade said little, but Lillian noticed how his men respected him, looking to him often and deferring to his occasional comments. After supper, Jackson and Caleb thanked Lillian profusely for the meal before retiring to the bunkhouse, leaving her alone with Wade. He helped her clear the table, carrying dishes to the basin where she had water heating for washing up. "You didn't have to cook," he said again as he stacked plates beside the basin. "I know," Lillian replied, rolling up her sleeves, "but I wanted to start earning my keep." Wade frowned slightly. "About that, we should be clear on terms." Lillian tensed, waiting. $500 is the debt, he said. "Figure room and board for you and Emma plus a fair wage for your work. $2 a week sound reasonable?" Lillian blinked in surprise. "You're going to pay me?" "Course I am," Wade replied as if it were obvious. "You work, you get paid. At that rate, you'll have worked off the debt in about 4 years, give or take. Sooner if you want to apply more of your wages to it." 4 years, Lillian repeated softly. It was both a lifetime and a moment. Emma would be walking and talking by then, no longer the tiny infant she now was. "Unless you want to leave sooner," Wade added, studying her reaction. "You're not a prisoner here, Lillian. If another opportunity comes along, or if you're unhappy, you can go. We just need to settle accounts." The use of her given name startled her almost as much as his words. It was the first time he'd called her anything but Mrs. Matthews, and something about the way he said "Lillian" made her heart beat a little faster. "I'm not planning to leave," she assured him. "I'm grateful for this chance, Wade, truly." He nodded, seeming relieved. "Good, that's good." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking. The room you're in, it's fine for now, but Emma will need her own space eventually. Come spring, I could add another room to the house. Nothing fancy, but it would give you both more space." The offer touched Lillian deeply. "That's very generous," Wade shrugged, suddenly awkward. "It's no trouble, place could use expanding anyway." He glanced toward the door. "I should check on the horses before turning in. Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Wade," she replied, watching as he donned his hat and stepped out into the darkness. As she finished washing the dishes, Lillian found herself smiling. 4 years was a long time, but perhaps it would be enough to build a new life for herself and Emma, to save money, to plan for a future that once again held promise. And perhaps, a small voice whispered in her mind, it would be enough time to truly know the quiet cowboy who had rescued them from the auction block, whose gruff exterior seemed to hide a gentle heart. The days quickly settled into a routine at Thornton Ranch. Lillian rose early to prepare breakfast for the men before they headed out to work with the cattle. She spent her mornings cleaning the house, doing laundry, and caring for Emma. Afternoons were for baking, mending, and gradually making small improvements to the Spartan living quarters. Wade had given her permission to fix the place up however you see fit, along with a small budget for fabric, paint, and other necessities. Lillian used it wisely, sewing curtains for the windows, creating cushions for the hard wooden chairs, and adding touches of color to rooms that had known only practicality. The men noticed and appreciated the changes. Jackson would exclaim over a new cushion or a bunch of wildflowers on the table. Caleb praised her cooking daily, claiming he'd never eaten so well in his life. Wade said little, but Lillian sometimes caught him looking around the transformed house with quiet satisfaction. Emma thrived in the clean mountain air. At 4 months, she was beginning to show her personality curious, determined, and quick to smile. The ranch hands doted on her, bringing her little gifts: a carved wooden rattle from Jackson, a tiny pair of moccasins from Caleb, who had traded with a passing flathead for them. Wade was more reserved with the baby, watching her from a distance as if uncertain how to interact with something so small and fragile. But occasionally, when he thought Lillian wasn't looking, she would catch him speaking softly to Emma, his weathered face gentling as the baby gurgled in response. As spring deepened into summer, the work on the ranch intensified. The men were gone from dawn until dusk, moving cattle to summer pastures, mending fences, and preparing for the fall roundup. Lillian found herself increasingly responsible for the smooth running of the household, a role she embraced with growing confidence. One evening in late June, as the long summer twilight painted the mountains gold, Lillian sat on the porch mending one of Wade's shirts. Emma lay on a blanket beside her, happily batting at a string of wooden beads Jackson had strung for her. The air was sweet with the scent of wild roses that grew alongside the creek, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Lillian looked up as Wade approached on horseback, returning later than usual from checking a distant pasture. He dismounted wearily, leading his horse toward the barn. Even from a distance, she could see the stiffness in his movements. When he emerged from the barn half an hour later, having seen to his horse's needs before his own, Lillian had supper-waiting venison stew that had been simmering all afternoon and fresh bread still warm from the oven. "You're late," she said as he climbed the porch steps. "I was beginning to worry. Fence line was worse than I expected," Wade replied, removing his hat and running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Had to rebuild most of the north section." "Alone?" Lillian frowned. "Why didn't you take Jackson or Caleb?" "They're finishing the branding in the east pasture." Wade winced slightly as he straightened. "It needed doing." "You're hurt," Lillian observed, setting aside her mending. "Just stiff," he dismissed. "Nothing a hot meal won't fix." But as he moved to enter the house, she saw him suppress another wince. "Wade Thornton, you sit down right here and let me have a look at you," she commanded, pointing to the porch bench. Surprise flickered across his face at her tone, but he complied, lowering himself carefully onto the bench. "It's nothing, Lillian. Just wrenched my back a bit moving posts." "Take off your shirt," she instructed, her concern overriding any sense of impropriety. Wade raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He unbuttoned his shirt with deliberate movements, revealing a lean, muscled torso marked by old scars, reminders of a hard life lived in unforgiving country. Turning slightly, he showed her where the pain was centered, a large bruise forming along his lower back. "Good Lord, Wade," Lillian breathed. "You could have broken something." "Didn't," he said simply. Lillian shook her head at his stubbornness. "Wait here." She went inside and returned moments later with a jar of liniment she'd made from wildflowers and herbs gathered during her walks around the ranch. "This will help with the pain and swelling." Wade remained still as she applied the ointment, her touch gentle but firm as she worked it into his injured muscles. Lillian tried to remain clinical, but she couldn't help noticing the strength evident in his body. The way his skin warmed beneath her fingers, the slight catch in his breath when she found a particularly tender spot. "You should be more careful," she scolded softly. "What would happen to this ranch if you were seriously injured?" "Jackson and Caleb are capable men," Wade replied, his voice lower than usual. "That's not the point." Lillian's hand stilled on his back. "You matter, Wade, not just as the owner of this ranch, but as—" She hesitated, uncertain how to express what she meant. Wade turned his head to look at her, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "As what, Lillian?" The air between them seemed to thicken. Emma chose that moment to let out a demanding squeal, breaking the tension. Lillian withdrew her hands and busied herself with replacing the lid on the jar of liniment. "As someone who has people who depend on him," she finished, moving to pick up her daughter. "Supper's ready whenever you are." Wade watched her for a long moment before nodding and carefully pulling his shirt back on. "Thank you," he said simply, but something in his voice made her think he was thanking her for more than just the liniment. That night, after Emma was asleep and the house quiet, Lillian lay awake thinking about the moment on the porch. In the 3 months since coming to Thornton Ranch, she had come to respect Wade deeply. He was fair, hardworking, and unfailingly kind beneath his reserved exterior. His hands were capable of both incredible strength and surprising gentleness. His rare smile transformed his face, erasing the hardness years of struggle had etched there. But respect was not all she felt, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her. Thomas had been dead barely half a year. She had come to this ranch as an employee, nothing more. And Wade had given no indication that he saw her as anything other than a woman working to pay off a debt. Yet there had been something in his eyes today, something that made her wonder if perhaps he too felt the subtle shift in their relationship. The following weeks brought little opportunity to explore these thoughts. July arrived with scorching heat that tested both humans and livestock. The men worked tirelessly to ensure the cattle had access to water and adequate grazing. Lillian rose before dawn to bake and cook during the coolest hours, spending the afternoons in the shade of the porch, where a constant breeze made the heat somewhat bearable. It was during one such afternoon that Jackson rode in at a gallop, his horse lathered and his face grim. "Mrs. Matthews," he called as he dismounted. "Is the boss here?" "No," Lillian replied, rising from her chair, Emma on her hip. "He and Caleb went to check the western range. What's wrong?" "Rustlers," Jackson said grimly. "Caught them trying to drive off about 30 head from the north pasture. Ran them off, but one of them got a shot off at me." He turned slightly, showing a blood-stained tear in his shirt sleeve. "You're hurt," Lillian exclaimed. "Come inside right away." The wound proved to be a deep graze rather than a serious injury, but it bled profusely. Lillian cleaned and bandaged it with practiced efficiency, having tended many such injuries during her marriage to Thomas. "You should lie down," she told Jackson when she'd finished. "You've lost blood." "No time," Jackson refused, already reaching for his hat. "Need to find the boss. Those rustlers might come back with more men." "Then I'm coming with you," Lillian decided. "You shouldn't ride alone in your condition." "Mrs. Matthews, I can't let you do that," Jackson protested. "It's not safe." "Emma and I will be fine," Lillian insisted. "I can ride and we'll be with you. It's safer than staying here alone if those rustlers return." Jackson hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Boss will have my hide, but you're right. Let me saddle a horse for you." 20 minutes later, they were riding toward the western range, Emma securely strapped to Lillian's chest in a makeshift sling. The little girl seemed to enjoy the motion, watching the passing landscape with wide, curious eyes. Lillian kept close to Jackson, concerned about the pallor of his face despite his assurances that he was fine. They found Wade and Caleb in a narrow valley about an hour's ride from the ranch. Both men were off their horses, examining tracks on the ground when Jackson called out to them. Wade's head snapped up, his expression changing from concentration to alarm as he saw Lillian and Emma with Jackson. He strode toward them quickly, his face darkening as he noticed Jackson's bandaged arm. "What happened?" he demanded, helping Lillian down from her horse while keeping a supporting hand on Jackson's leg to prevent him from dismounting. Jackson explained about the rustlers while Caleb examined his wound more closely. Wade's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. "And you brought Lillian and the baby out here?" he asked when Jackson had finished, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "It was my decision," Lillian interjected quickly. "I didn't want to stay at the ranch alone, and Jackson was in no condition to ride by himself." Wade's eyes met hers, a storm of emotions in their blue depths. "You could have been hurt, both of you." His gaze dropped to Emma, who was contentedly chewing on her fist, oblivious to the tension around her. "But we weren't," Lillian pointed out, "and now we know about the rustlers." Wade's jaw clenched, but he nodded once, acknowledging her point. "Caleb, take Jackson back to the ranch. Get him settled, then ride for the doctor in Silver Creek, just to be safe." "I don't need no doctor," Jackson protested. "That wasn't a suggestion," Wade said firmly. "Lillian, you and Emma will go with them." "And leave you out here alone," Lillian challenged, surprising herself with her boldness. "Those rustlers could come back." "I can handle myself," Wade replied. "I need to follow these tracks, see where they're heading." Lillian stood her ground. "Then we'll wait at the ranch together, all of us. You can track the rustlers tomorrow with Jackson and Caleb both." For a moment it seemed Wade would refuse. Then, glancing again at Emma, his expression softened slightly. "Fine," he conceded. "We'll all go back. But first thing tomorrow, Caleb and I are tracking those rustlers." The ride back to the ranch was tense, with Wade constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Lillian could feel his displeasure radiating from him. Though she noticed, he kept his horse close to hers, positioning himself between her and any potential threat. That evening, after Jackson had been settled in the bunkhouse with strict instructions to rest, and Caleb had ridden for the doctor, Wade finally confronted Lillian in the kitchen where she was preparing supper. "What you did today was dangerous," he said without preamble, his voice low to avoid waking Emma, who was napping in her box cradle nearby. Lillian continued cutting vegetables, keeping her eyes on her task. "I made the decision I thought was best under the circumstances." "Best?" Wade moved closer, forcing her to look at him. "Riding out with an injured man, bringing a baby into potential danger, how was that best?" "What would you have had me do?" Lillian countered, setting down her knife. "Stay alone at the ranch with Emma when armed rustlers could have returned at any moment." Wade ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I would have had you stay out of danger." "There was no safe choice," Lillian said more gently, recognizing the fear behind his anger. "I did what I thought would protect Emma best." Wade's eyes held hers for a long moment before he sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders. "I know," he admitted. When I saw you riding up with Jackson with Emma." He shook his head, unable to find words for what he'd felt. "You were worried," Lillian finished for him. "Yes." The single word carried more weight than a longer explanation could have. Impulsively, Lillian reached out and touched his arm. "We're safe, Wade, all of us." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then covered it with his own. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. "I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you," he said quietly. "Either of you." The admission hung in the air between them, filled with implications neither was quite ready to address. Lillian's heart beat faster as Wade's thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles. Emma's sudden cry broke the moment. Lillian withdrew her hand reluctantly to tend to the baby, and by the time she had soothed Emma back to sleep, Wade had stepped outside to check the property before nightfall. The rustler incident marked a turning point in their relationship. Though neither spoke directly of what had passed between them in the kitchen, a new awareness colored their interactions. Wade began finding reasons to return to the house during the day, checking if Lillian needed anything from town. bringing her wildflowers, he claimed, were just growing in the way of the fence line, stopping by to see Emma's latest accomplishments as she learned to sit up and reach for objects. Lillian, for her part, found herself looking forward to these visits, timing her baking so fresh bread or pie would be ready when Wade returned from the range, setting aside the tenderest cuts of meat for his plate, watching from the window for his return at day's end. Summer mellowed into early autumn. The rustlers never returned, though Wade and his men remained vigilant. The doctor had pronounced Jackson's wound clean and healing well, and by August he was back to full duties. The ranch prospered under Wade's careful management, with the promise of a good profit when the cattle went to market in October. One crisp September evening, as gold and crimson leaves drifted from the cottonwoods along the creek, Wade returned from town with more packages than usual. Along with the regular supplies, he carried a small wooden crate that he handled with particular care. "What's this?" Lillian asked as he set it on the table. "For Emma," Wade replied, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "It's her half-birthday today, 6 months old." Touched that he had remembered, Lillian opened the crate to find a beautiful wooden rocking horse, small enough for a baby just learning to sit, but sturdy enough to last for years. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with a flowing mane and tail carved from real horsehair and a tiny saddle made of soft leather. "Wade," she breathed, lifting it from the crate. "It's beautiful." "There's a toy maker in Silver Creek," Wade explained, watching her reaction closely. "Thought she might like it, being on a ranch and all." Emma, who had been playing on a blanket nearby, squealed with delight when Lillian showed her the horse. Her tiny hands reached for it eagerly, and when Lillian placed her astride the miniature saddle, supporting her with one hand, Emma's face lit with joy. "She loves it," Lillian said, looking up at Wade with shining eyes. "Thank you." Wade's smile, one of his rare, full smiles that transformed his entire face, warmed her to her core. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. "For me?" Lillian asked in surprise. Wade nodded, suddenly seeming almost shy. "It's not much." Lillian unwrapped the package to find a beautiful silver hairpin with a small Montana sapphire set in the design of a wildflower. "Oh, Wade," she whispered, running her finger over the delicate craftsmanship. "It's exquisite." "Reminded me of the flowers you like to put on the table," he said quietly. "And the color." He gestured vaguely toward her eyes. The implication that he had chosen it because the stone matched her eyes brought a flush to Lillian's cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll treasure it." That night, after Emma was asleep, Lillian stood before the small mirror in her room and pinned up her hair with Wade's gift. The sapphire caught the lamplight, glowing with a deep blue fire against her dark blonde hair. She studied her reflection, seeing not just the exhausted widow who had stood on the auction block 6 months ago, but a woman coming back to life, her cheeks fuller, her eyes brighter, her spirit stronger. She was still gazing at the hairpin when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Wade standing there, his expression uncertain. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. "I was just—" He trailed off as he noticed the hairpin in her hair. "It suits you," he finished softly. "I love it," Lillian replied, touching it self-consciously. "Did you need something?" Wade hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "Would you walk with me? Just on the porch. The night is clear and the stars are something to see." Though surprised by the invitation, Lillian nodded. "Let me check on Emma first." The baby was sleeping soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of dreams. Lillian tucked the blanket more securely around her before joining Wade at the front door. He offered his arm with formal courtesy, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him as they stepped onto the porch. The night was indeed magnificent. Without the haze of summer heat, the stars burned with incredible clarity in the velvet blackness of the sky. The moon, just past full, cast enough light to silhouette the mountains against the horizon. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and the distant howl of a lone wolf. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, gazing at the night sky. Wade's arm was warm beneath Lillian's hand, a point of contact that seemed to grow more significant with each passing moment. "I've been thinking," Wade said finally, his deep voice quiet in the stillness. "About the future." Lillian's heart quickened. "Oh." "The ranch is doing well," he continued. "We'll make a good profit on the cattle drive. I've been setting aside money to expand more land to the north, maybe another 100 head next spring." "That's wonderful," Lillian said, genuinely happy for his success. "I've also been thinking about the house," Wade went on. "Not just adding a room for Emma, but making other improvements. A proper bathroom inside, maybe a bigger kitchen." "Those would be nice additions," Lillian agreed, wondering where this conversation was leading. Wade turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. In the moonlight, his features were cast in silver and shadow, his eyes dark pools that held her gaze intently. "Lillian," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm not good with words, so I'll just say it plain. These past months with you and Emma here, they've changed everything. This place was just a house before. Now it's becoming a home." Lillian's breath caught in her throat as understanding dawned. "Wade, I know it hasn't been a year since Thomas passed," he continued quickly. "And I know you came here out of necessity, not choice. But I've come to care for you, Lillian, and for Emma too. More than I thought possible." "What are you saying?" Lillian asked, needing to hear the words clearly. Wade's hands tightened gently around hers. "I'm asking if you might consider staying, not as someone working off a debt, but as my wife. I'm asking if you might give me the chance to be a father to Emma, to help her grow up strong and happy on this land." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, surprising her with their suddenness. "Wade, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to answer now," he assured her quickly. "Take time to think. I know it's sudden, and I know you might not feel." Lillian silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "I care for you too," she whispered. "More than I ever expected to care for anyone again after Thomas. But marriage is a big step." Wade nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It is. That's why I want you to be sure. Think about it, Lillian. Whatever you decide, know that you and Emma have a place here for as long as you want it, regardless of your answer." The generosity of the offer touched her deeply. This man, who had already done so much for her and Emma, was now offering them his name, his protection, his future, asking nothing in return but the chance to love them. Impulsively, Lillian rose on tiptoe and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she murmured. Wade's hand came up to touch the spot where her lips had been, his expression one of wonder. Then, with gentle deliberation, he bent and kissed her properly, a soft, questioning kiss that asked rather than demanded, that offered rather than took. When they parted, Lillian's heart was racing, and she knew her decision was already made. But Wade deserved a thoughtful answer, not one given in the heat of emotion. So she simply smiled and squeezed his hands before bidding him good night. As she slipped back into her room, checking once more on Emma's peaceful slumber, Lillian touched the sapphire hairpin and allowed herself to imagine a future she had thought lost forever: a loving husband, a secure home, perhaps more children to join Emma in time. A life built on mutual respect and growing love, rather than necessity and obligation. The thought filled her with quiet joy. The following week passed in a blur of meaningful glances and careful touches. Wade did not press Lillian for an answer. true to his word that she should take time to consider his proposal. But his attention to her and Emma grew even more pronounced, bringing special treats from town, spending more time with the baby, helping with chores around the house that had previously been Lillian's sole responsibility. Emma, now adept at sitting up and beginning to crawl, became increasingly attached to Wade. She would squeal with delight when he entered the room, reaching for him with determined little hands. To Lillian's surprise and pleasure, Wade responded with growing confidence, lifting the baby with careful hands, speaking to her in the same low, gentle voice he used with nervous colts. One afternoon, Lillian returned from hanging laundry to find Wade sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, Emma on his lap. He was reading to her from a book of children's stories he'd brought back from town, his deep voice giving life to tales of clever rabbits and wise bears. Emma was utterly captivated, her tiny hand resting trustingly on Wade's larger one as he turned the pages. The scene confirmed what Lillian already knew in her heart. Wade Thornton would be a wonderful father to Emma, patient and kind, strong yet gentle. And he would be a good husband, too, respectful, considerate, and steadfast. She had loved Thomas deeply, and a part of her heart would always belong to him. But she had room in her heart for this new love, different but no less real. Thomas would have wanted her and Emma to be happy, to be cared for, to have a family again. That evening, after supper, when Jackson and Caleb had returned to the bunkhouse, and Emma was asleep, Lillian asked Wade to walk with her on the porch again. The night was cooler than the week before, with the first hint of winter in the air. The stars seemed even brighter, diamonds sharp against the darkness. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Lillian began, her hands clasped tightly before her. Wade stood very still beside her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. And Lillian turned to face him fully. "My answer is yes, Wade. I would be honored to be your wife and to have you as Emma's father." For a moment, Wade didn't move, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. Then, with a swiftness that took her breath away, he swept her into his arms, lifting her clear off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of emotion. "You're sure?" he asked when he set her down, his hand still at her waist. Lillian smiled up at him, her heart full. "I'm sure. I care for you deeply, Wade. I believe we can build a good life together." Wade's answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He cupped her face in his calloused hands with infinite tenderness. "I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of that trust," he promised. "You and Emma, you're the family I never thought I'd have." His kiss this time was deeper, filled with promise and longing held in check for months. Lillian responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she gave herself to the moment without reservation. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Wade pressed his forehead to hers. "When?" he asked simply. "Soon," Lillian replied. "Before winter sets in, I don't want to wait." "Neither do I," Wade agreed. 2 weeks. That would give us time to prepare and for me to finish the cattle drive." 2 weeks, Lillian confirmed, her heart light with joy. "Nothing fancy, just us and Caleb and Jackson as witnesses." "And the preacher from Silver Creek," Wade added. "I want to do this proper, Lillian. You deserve a real wedding." They spent another hour on the porch, planning their future together, dreaming of the years ahead. Wade spoke of his hopes for the ranch, for the family they would build together. Lillian shared her own dreams of making their house truly a home, of watching Emma grow strong and happy, of perhaps giving her siblings in time. The 2 weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Wade rode into Silver Creek to speak with the preacher and to order supplies for a modest celebration. Lillian, with help from the wives of neighboring ranchers who were delighted by the news, sewed a simple but elegant wedding dress from cream-colored fabric Wade had brought from town. Jackson and Caleb, grinning like schoolboys, took on extra duties to ensure the ranch would run smoothly during the brief honeymoon Wade had planned 3 days at a small cabin he owned by a mountain lake. On the morning of their wedding day, Lillian stood in her room, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The cream dress complemented her fair coloring, and she had arranged her hair simply, adorned only by Wade's sapphire hairpin. Emma, dressed in a new white gown, sat happily on the bed, playing with the ribbons of her tiny shoes. A knock at the door revealed Jackson's wife, Mary, who had ridden over early to help Lillian prepare. "Oh, Lillian," Mary breathed. "You look beautiful. Wade won't know what hit him." Lillian smiled, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Is everything ready?" "All set," Mary confirmed. "The preacher's here, and we've got the table laid out for the celebration after." "Wade's pacing like a caged mountain lion, poor man," she grinned. "Never seen him so nervous." The simple ceremony took place in the ranch house living room, which had been transformed with bouquets of late-blooming wildflowers and evergreen boughs. A small group had gathered: Jackson and Mary, Caleb and his sweetheart from town, the preacher, and a few neighboring ranchers with their families. Wade stood by the fireplace, wearing a new suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean strength, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When Lillian entered with Emma in her arms, a hush fell over the room. Wade's eyes never left her as she walked toward him, his expression one of wonder and deep emotion. As she reached his side, he extended a hand to steady her, then gently touched Emma's cheek in greeting. The preacher's words were traditional and heartfelt, speaking of commitment, partnership, and enduring love. When it came time for the vows, Wade's voice was clear and unwavering as he promised to cherish and protect Lillian and Emma for all his days. Lillian's own voice trembled slightly with emotion as she made the same promise in return. "By the authority vested in me," the preacher concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Thornton, you may kiss your bride." Wade's kiss was gentle but full of promise, appropriate for their audience but conveying clearly the depth of his feelings. When they turned to face their friends, Emma squealed with delight, as if understanding the significance of the moment, bringing laughter and applause from the assembled guests. The celebration that followed was joyful and relaxed, a feast of roasted venison, fresh bread, and pies, with music provided by Caleb on the fiddle and one of the neighbors on the harmonica. Wade and Lillian danced, Emma watching wide-eyed from Mary's lap. And then Wade surprised everyone by dancing with his new daughter, holding her securely as he moved slowly around the room, speaking to her in a low voice that made the baby giggle with delight. As the afternoon waned, the guests gradually departed with warm wishes and knowing smiles. Jackson and Mary took charge of Emma, who would stay with them in the main house while Wade and Lillian spent their brief honeymoon at the lake cabin. The ride to the cabin was peaceful, the autumn landscape glowing in the late afternoon light. Wade pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing stories of his early days in the territory. Lillian listened, enjoying the comfortable ease that had developed between them, anticipating the deeper intimacy to come. The cabin proved to be small but charming, a single room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy bed piled with quilts, and windows that overlooked the crystal-clear lake. Wade had arranged for everything in advance, with firewood stacked neatly by the hearth and provisions stored in a small pantry. As dusk fell, Wade built a fire while Lillian prepared a simple supper from the supplies he had brought. They ate by firelight, speaking little but exchanging glances filled with meaning. When the meal was finished, Wade rose and came to where Lillian sat, extending his hand to her. "Mrs. Thornton," he said softly, the name still new and wonderful to her ears. Lillian placed her hand in his, allowing him to draw her to her feet and into his arms. His kiss was different now, unhurried yet urgent, tender yet demanding. This was no longer the careful restraint of courtship, but the rightful claim of a husband to his wife. Later, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, the fire casting a golden glow over their joined forms, Lillian rested her head on Wade's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, his other arm holding her securely against him. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. Lillian smiled, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Very," she assured him. "Are you?" Wade's arms tightened around her. "More than I ever thought possible," he admitted. "When I saw you on that auction block with Emma, I never imagined that we would end up here." Lillian finished for him. "That I would find my heart again," Wade corrected softly. "After Mary died, I thought that part of me was gone for good." Lillian raised herself on one elbow to look into his face. "I felt the same after Thomas," she confessed. "I thought my heart had died with him. But it was just waiting for you." Wade drew her down for another kiss, slow and deep, that soon rekindled the passion they had just satisfied. This time their loving was slower, more deliberate, each learning the other's body with increasing confidence and care. In the quiet aftermath, as Wade drifted toward sleep beside her, Lillian gazed out the window at the star-filled sky above the lake. 6 months ago, she had stood on an auction block, her future dark and terrifying. Now she lay in the arms of a man who cherished her, secure in the knowledge that she and Emma were loved, protected, and home at last. The next 3 days passed in a haze of newfound intimacy and simple pleasures. They swam in the cold, clear lake, hiked in the surrounding forest where the aspens were turning gold, and spent long hours before the fire, talking of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Wade spoke more freely than he ever had before, sharing stories of his childhood in Texas, his experiences during the war, and his journey to Montana in search of a new beginning. Lillian, in turn, told him of her life in St. Louis, her courtship with Thomas, and the dreams that had brought her west. On their final evening at the cabin, as they sat on the small porch watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, Wade took Lillian's hand and pressed something into her palm. Looking down, she saw a small gold locket on a delicate chain. "Open it," Wade urged softly. Inside, Lillian found a tiny portrait of Emma on one side, her baby face captured with remarkable skill. The other side was empty. "For our next child," Wade explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Whenever that blessing might come." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift and the promise it contained. "It's perfect," she whispered, leaning into his embrace. "Thank you. Thank you," Wade countered, pressing a kiss to her temple, "for giving me a family." They returned to the ranch the following day to find Emma thriving under Jackson and Mary's care, though the baby nearly lunged from Mary's arms when she saw her mother. The transition from widow and hired help to wife and mistress of Thornton Ranch was remarkably smooth. The ranch hands treated Lillian with the same respect as before, but with an added deference that acknowledged her new position. Neighbors who had attended the wedding stopped by with gifts and good wishes, welcoming her officially into the small community of ranching families. Winter arrived early that year, with the first heavy snow falling just 3 weeks after the wedding. The cattle had been moved to sheltered pastures, the hay safely stored in the barn, the house made snug against the coming cold. Wade had completed the promised addition to the house before the weather turned a small but comfortable room for Emma, connected to the main bedroom he now shared with Lillian. The long winter evenings were filled with contentment. Wade would read aloud while Lillian sewed or knitted by the fire. Emma, now crawling with determination and beginning to pull herself up on furniture, would explore the room under their watchful eyes until sleep claimed her. Then husband and wife would retire to their bedroom, where they continued to discover new depths to their passion and tenderness for each other. Christmas brought a special joy as they celebrated their first holiday as a family. Wade surprised Lillian with a beautiful rocking chair he had made himself in the barn during the long evenings of autumn. Lillian presented Wade with a hand-knitted sweater and a book of poetry she had ordered from back east. For Emma, they had simple toys and a tiny silver bracelet that Wade promised would grow with her. As winter deepened, bringing days when the snow drifted against the house and the wind howled like a living thing, Lillian made an announcement that brought tears of joy to Wade's eyes. She was expecting their child, due in the late summer. "Are you happy?" she asked as he held her close, his hand resting reverently on her still flat stomach. "Beyond words," Wade replied, his voice choked with emotion. "Emma will have a brother or sister and will be even more of a family." The remainder of the winter passed in a glow of anticipation. Wade became even more protective of Lillian, insisting she rest frequently and taking on household tasks to spare her exertion. Lillian, whose pregnancy was proceeding without complications, tolerated his concern with loving amusement, knowing it stemmed from the depth of his feelings for her and their unborn child. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and new growth. Emma celebrated her first birthday with a small party attended by neighboring families. Now walking with growing confidence, she toddled from guest to guest, charming everyone with her bright smile and curious nature. Wade watched his daughter with undisguised pride, and Lillian's heart swelled with love for them both. By summer, Lillian's pregnancy was clearly visible, her slender frame now gracefully rounded. Wade found her more beautiful than ever, telling her so each night as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom. Emma, though too young to fully understand, seemed to sense the coming change, patting Lillian's growing belly with gentle hands and listening wide-eyed when Wade explained that a baby brother or sister was growing inside. On a warm August evening, as the setting sun turned the distant mountains to purple and gold, Lillian felt the first pains of labor. Wade sent Jackson riding for the midwife while Mary came to help, and Caleb took charge of entertaining Emma. The labor was long but uncomplicated. Wade remained by Lillian's side throughout, wiping her brow, holding her hand through contractions, murmuring words of encouragement and love. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, their son was born a healthy, robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. "William," Lillian whispered as she held him for the first time, "after your father." Wade, overcome with emotion, could only nod as he gazed at his son with wonder. Later that day, he brought Emma to meet her baby brother. The little girl approached the bed cautiously, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Baby?" she asked, pointing to the bundle in Lillian's arms. "Yes, Emma," Wade said, lifting her gently onto the bed beside Lillian. "This is William, your brother." Emma studied the infant solemnly, then reached out to touch his tiny hand with one finger. "My baby," she declared with the certainty of a child who has made up her mind. Lillian and Wade exchanged smiles over their children's heads. "Yes," Lillian agreed softly, "your baby brother." As Wade sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Lillian's shoulders and Emma leaning against his side, the family portrait was complete. From the auction block to this moment of perfect happiness, Lillian's journey had been one of loss and redemption, of fear and courage, of ending and beginning. Looking up at Wade, seeing the love and pride shining in his eyes, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that their story was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, the harsh realities of ranching life, the unpredictability of the Montana wilderness, the natural ups and downs of family life. But they would face them together, stronger for the bond they had forged through adversity and choice. "I love you," she whispered to Wade as baby William slept in her arms and Emma dozed against her father's chest. Wade's smile was tender as he bent to kiss her. "And I love you, Lillian Thornton, now and always." 5 years later, Thornton Ranch had prospered beyond Wade's most ambitious dreams. The herd had grown to over 500 head. The ranch boundaries expanded to include prime grazing land to the north and east. The original house had been enlarged twice more, now boasting a spacious kitchen, a proper dining room and bedrooms for each of the children. Emma, now 6, and attending the small school in Silver Creek. William, 5 and already showing his father's affinity for horses, and 3-year-old Mary, named for Wade's sister, a spirited little girl with her mother's blonde curls and gentle nature. On the anniversary of their wedding, Wade and Lillian stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the autumn landscape in gold and crimson. From the yard came the sound of children's laughter as Emma organized some game with her brothers, her natural leadership evident even at her young age. "You ever think about that day at the auction?" Wade asked, his arm around Lillian's waist. Lillian leaned into his embrace, considering the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not with fear anymore, but with gratitude. If not for that terrible day, we might never have found each other." Wade nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I remember looking at you, standing there with Emma in your arms and feeling something I couldn't name then." His arm tightened around her. "Now I know it was the beginning of love." "For me too," Lillian agreed softly, though I was too frightened to recognize it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their children play in the yard that was bordered by flowers Lillian had planted and a fence Wade had built. The ranch buildings were well maintained, the corrals full of quality horses, the pastures dotted with healthy cattle. It was everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of building together. "Are you happy, Lillian?" Wade asked, echoing the question he had asked that first night at the lake cabin. Lillian turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him with all the love that had grown and deepened over their years together. "Completely," she answered against his lips. "This life, this family, this love, it's more than I ever dared to hope for." Wade's answering kiss conveyed his agreement more eloquently than words could have. As the last light of day gilded the land around them, they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the evidence of their love and labor, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. From the depths of despair to the heights of joy, from the auction block to the sanctuary of true love, Lillian's journey had been extraordinary. And as she looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, she knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of their story were still to come.